The apartment was silent, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy in your chest. Emily stood in the middle of the living room, heels in her hand, staring at the floor-to-ceiling windows. 3 years ago, this view had made her feel powerful. Tonight, it made her feel small. Her lawyer quietly closed his briefcase and spoke in a calm, almost careful tone. Because of the agreement she had signed before the wedding, she would not receive any of the shared assets. No house, no savings, no financial support, just her personal belongings. The words were polite, professional, and final. She didn't argue. She didn't break down. She simply nodded, as if she had been expecting it all along. Around her, everything still looked perfect. The marble counters shined under soft lighting. The white couch sat untouched. The grand piano in the corner, the one she never learned to play, reflected the city lights like glass. It all looked expensive. It all looked impressive. And none of it belonged to her anymore. She walked into the bedroom and opened the closet. Designer dresses hung in perfect rows. Shoes lined the shelves. Handbags she once thought were symbols of success now felt like costumes from a life that wasn't real. She didn't reach for any of them. Instead, she pulled out a small suitcase. Not the large luxury luggage set. Just one simple case. Because in truth, that was all she owned. When she zipped it closed, her reflection caught her attention in the mirror. Her makeup was flawless. Her hair perfectly styled. But her eyes looked distant. 3 years ago, she believed she was choosing security. She didn't realize she was choosing a cage. Her phone buzzed. A message from Daniel's assistant informed her that the driver would be downstairs in 10 minutes. Not Daniel himself. Even at the end, he kept distance between them. That detail hurt more than she expected. She looked around one last time. The wedding photo still hung on the wall. In the picture, she was smiling widely, almost glowing. She barely recognized that version of herself. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual. The quiet hum of the cables was the only sound. When the doors opened and the cool night air touched her face, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't relief. It wasn't sadness. It was space. The car pulled away from the building, and she watched the tower shrink in the side mirror. 3 years of her life fading into distance. She leaned back in the seat and closed her eyes. 3 years earlier, she had been exhausted. Working 2 jobs. Barely sleeping. Counting coins at the grocery store. Back then, she believed money would solve everything. Back then, she believed love could wait. And when Daniel walked into her life, she thought she had found a shortcut. She didn't know shortcuts sometimes cost more than the long road. As the city lights stretched endlessly ahead, Emily opened her eyes and finally allowed herself to think the one question she had avoided for years. How did I lose myself? Fade into the past. 3 years earlier, Emily's life was loud, busy, and painfully ordinary. Her alarm rang every morning at 5:30, and most days she woke up already tired. The apartment she lived in was small, with thin walls and a heater that only worked when it wanted to. The kitchen light flickered. The bathroom sink leaked. But it was hers, even if she could barely afford it. She worked the early shift at a coffee shop downtown. By 7 a.m., she was already on her feet, tying her apron while repeating the same greeting over and over again. Good morning. What can I get started for you? Some customers smiled. Most didn't. She moved quickly, carefully counting tips in her head, knowing every dollar mattered. Rent was due in 2 weeks. Her student loan payment was overdue again. She had exactly $43 in her bank account. After the coffee shop, she didn't go home. She took the bus across town to her second job at a clothing store. Folding shirts. Rearranging displays. Standing under bright lights until her back ached. By the time she got home at night, she didn't have the energy to cook. Sometimes dinner was cereal. Sometimes it was nothing. Still, there was something inside her that hadn't broken. On Sundays, her only day off, she would sit at her tiny kitchen table with a notebook. She wrote plans. Ideas. Dreams she didn't tell anyone about. She wanted a better job. Maybe something in marketing. Maybe something creative. She wasn't sure how she would get there. She just knew she didn't want to stay stuck. But dreams feel different when you're tired. One evening at the coffee shop, during the slow hour before closing, the bell above the door rang, and a man walked in wearing a navy suit that looked expensive without trying too hard. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. He carried himself like someone who was used to being listened to. His name, she would later learn, was Daniel. He ordered a simple black coffee. No sugar. No rush. While she prepared it, he watched her. Not in a strange way, but with focus. When she handed him the cup, he noticed the faint bruise on her wrist from bumping into a metal shelf earlier that day. "Long day?" he asked. She gave a small laugh. "Long life." He smiled at that. Not a pity smile. Something softer. "You look like someone who works too hard," he said. She shrugged. "I don't really have a choice." He tilted his head slightly. "Everyone has a choice. Sometimes they just don't see it yet." It wasn't a dramatic moment. No music. No sparks flying. But something about the way he said it made her pause. No one had ever suggested her life could be different. People usually just told her to work harder. He came back the next day. And the day after that. Always at the same time. Always calm. Sometimes he asked about her day. Sometimes he just listened. He didn't talk about money, but it was obvious he had it. His watch alone probably cost more than her monthly rent. One night, just before closing, he asked if she had ever been to a restaurant called Bellamy's. She shook her head. She had barely heard of it. "Let me take you," he said simply. She hesitated for half a second. Then she said yes. As she locked up the coffee shop that night, she didn't know her life was about to split into two versions. The one she had always known, and the one that looked easier. Much easier. And when you've been drowning for a long time, even the smallest lifeboat looks like salvation. Bellamy's was nothing like any place Emily had ever been. The lights were soft, the music low, and the air smelled faintly of something expensive she couldn't name. The host greeted Daniel like he was expected. Not just welcomed, expected. That detail didn't go unnoticed. Emily suddenly felt aware of her simple black dress, the one she had almost decided not to wear. Daniel noticed her hesitation and gently placed his hand on her back as they walked in. "Relax," he said quietly. "You belong anywhere you decide to be." No one had ever said something like that to her before. Dinner felt effortless. Daniel ordered without looking at the menu for long. He explained things in simple ways when she didn't recognize a dish. He never made her feel embarrassed. When she laughed, he watched her like she was the only person in the room. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about bills. She wasn't calculating how much something cost. She wasn't tired. She felt chosen. After that night, things moved quickly. Daniel introduced her to a different world. Private events, rooftop dinners, art shows where people spoke confidently about ideas she barely understood. He drove a car that was quiet and smooth. He lived in a high-rise apartment with windows that stretched across the skyline. The first time she walked into his place, she stopped near the entrance. The floor shined. The furniture looked untouched. The city lights reflected off the glass like stars below them. "This is beautiful," she whispered. "It could be yours too," he said. The words hung in the air. He didn't rush her. He didn't pressure her. But he made the future feel certain. Stable. Easy. Soon, she wasn't taking the bus anymore. Daniel would send a car to pick her up after work. He encouraged her to quit the clothing store. "You're exhausted," he told her. "Focus on yourself for once." It sounded caring. Slowly, he started choosing things for her. He suggested dresses. He picked restaurants. He corrected small details in her stories when she spoke too quickly. "Slow down," he would say gently. "You don't have to rush anymore." At first, she thought he was helping her grow. She didn't notice how often she stopped deciding things on her own. 3 months after they met, Daniel proposed. No huge crowd. No dramatic speech. Just a quiet evening in his apartment with the city glowing behind him. "I can give you a life where you never have to worry again," he said. And she believed him. Before the wedding, his lawyer handed her a document. It was several pages long. Legal language. Calm explanations. Daniel stood beside her and kept his voice relaxed. "It's just a paper that protects what I built before we met," he said. "It doesn't change us. It's just smart." She skimmed it. She didn't fully understand it, but she trusted him. She signed it in less than a minute. That signature felt small at the time. It would become the most expensive decision of her life. The wedding was elegant. White flowers, soft music, smiling guests who barely knew her. Her old friends didn't quite fit into the room. Some didn't come at all. She told herself it didn't matter. She was stepping into something bigger. As she stood beside Daniel during the ceremony, she felt safe. She also felt something else. A quiet voice inside her asking, "What are you giving up?" She ignored it, because when you finally escape struggle, you don't look back at the door you closed. You walk forward, even if you don't know what's waiting on the other side. The first few months of marriage felt smooth. Almost too smooth. Emily moved into Daniel's penthouse fully this time. Not as a guest, not as a girlfriend, but as his wife. The closet space doubled. The mirrors were bigger. The silence inside the apartment felt expensive. She didn't wake up at 5:30 anymore. No alarm. No bus rides. No coffee shop rush. She slept in, drank fresh juice on the balcony, watched the city move below her while she stood still above it. At first, it felt like she had won. Daniel liked routine. Breakfast at the same time. Gym in the private building facility. Meetings throughout the day. He encouraged her to relax. "You've worked hard enough," he would say. "Enjoy this." So she tried. She decorated parts of the apartment, rearranged flowers, experimented with cooking. She even bought a few books about marketing, thinking maybe she could slowly build something of her own. But when she mentioned the idea of taking a course, Daniel smiled in a way she couldn't quite read. "Why would you want to go back to that?" he asked. "You don't need to work anymore." It sounded generous, but it felt limiting. Her old friends stopped calling as much. Some felt uncomfortable in the new environment. Others assumed she had changed. When she invited one of them over for dinner, Daniel made a small comment afterward. "They're nice," he said carefully, "but they don't really fit into this world." This world. The phrase echoed. Gradually, she saw them less. Daniel preferred private events with business partners and their polished wives. At those gatherings, Emily smiled often and spoke carefully. When she shared an opinion, Daniel would sometimes interrupt gently. "Let me explain it better," he'd say. He never raised his voice. He never insulted her. He simply corrected her, adjusted her, shaped her. One afternoon, she stood in front of her closet, staring at rows of designer dresses. She realized she hadn't bought anything herself in months. Daniel either picked it out or approved it. She tried calling him during the day once, just to talk. His assistant answered. "He's in meetings all day." That night at dinner, she mentioned feeling restless. Daniel looked at her calmly. "Restless? From what?" "I just feel like I should be doing something. Building something." He set his fork down and leaned back slightly. "You don't need ambition anymore," he said. "You have stability." The sentence landed softly, but something inside her tightened. Days began blending together. The apartment was beautiful, but it was too quiet during the day. Sometimes she would walk from room to room without purpose, just to feel movement. The windows showed a lively city. Inside, it felt paused. She started noticing small things. How Daniel controlled every financial decision. How she didn't know the passwords to shared accounts. How her name wasn't on certain documents. One evening, she stood alone in the living room while Daniel worked late in his office down the hall. She looked at the grand piano in the corner and realized she had never touched it. The house was full of things she didn't use. And slowly, she understood something unsettling. She had traded her busy life for a comfortable one. But comfort was beginning to feel like confinement. That night, lying beside Daniel while he scrolled through emails, she stared at the ceiling. She wasn't exhausted anymore. She was empty. And emptiness can be louder than struggle. The first crack didn't come from a fight. It came from silence. One afternoon, Emily was sitting alone at the kitchen island, sunlight pouring through the windows. The apartment was spotless. Quiet. Perfect. She had nowhere to be and nothing urgent to do. She opened her laptop and searched for online marketing courses. Just to look. Just to feel like her brain was stretching again. She found one that started in 2 weeks. She almost clicked enroll. Instead, she closed the screen when she heard Daniel's footsteps behind her. That small hesitation bothered her more than anything. Later that evening, during dinner, she tried again. I was thinking about taking a short course, she said casually. Just a few weeks. Something in digital marketing. Daniel didn't look angry. He looked confused. Why? He asked. I just want to learn. Maybe build something small. He took a sip of water before answering. Build what? She didn't have a perfect answer. And for some reason, that made her feel small. You don't need to fill your time with random goals, he continued. You have everything you need. Everything you need. The words were meant to comfort her. Instead, they felt like a ceiling. Over the next few days, she paid closer attention to herself. To the way she paused before speaking. To the way she filtered her thoughts before sharing them. She started noticing how often she asked for permission without realizing it. One evening, she found an old box tucked behind some storage bins in the closet. Inside were things from her previous apartment, photos, a chipped coffee mug, a small notebook filled with handwritten ideas. She sat on the floor and flipped through the pages. Plans. Business names she had brainstormed. Budget sketches. Marketing campaign ideas for imaginary companies. Her handwriting back then was rushed but alive. Now her days were calm. Too calm. She picked up her phone and scrolled through old pictures. There she was in her tiny kitchen, hair messy, holding a cheap birthday cake for herself because she couldn't afford anything else. She remembered that night clearly. She had been exhausted, yes, but hopeful. Hope had energy. Comfort had quiet. And quiet was starting to feel like disappearance. The next morning, Daniel mentioned a new investment he was making. Large numbers. High risk. He explained it quickly, confidently. She tried to ask a question about it, something simple about market timing, but he waved it off gently. Don't worry about it, he said. It's complicated. Complicated. The word stung more than she expected. She had once managed 2 jobs, bills, deadlines. She wasn't incapable. She wasn't simple. She was just unused. That night, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, she studied her reflection again. Perfect skin. Elegant clothes. Expensive surroundings. But behind her eyes, something was missing. I miss who I was, she whispered. It wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't even about love. It was about presence. About having weight in her own life. And for the first time since the wedding, she allowed herself to admit something she had been quietly avoiding. She didn't feel like a partner. She felt like an accessory. And accessories are replaceable. The realization didn't make her angry. It made her awake. The moment didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with information. One evening, Emily was walking down the hallway when she heard Daniel's voice coming from his office. The door was slightly open. He was on the phone, speaking in a low, controlled tone. It's aggressive, yes, he said. But the upside is worth it. We'll shift the funds quietly. Shift the funds. Her stomach tightened. She stepped back, not wanting to eavesdrop, but the words lingered. Funds. Risk. Quietly. Later that night, while they sat across from each other at the dining table, she brought it up carefully. I overheard part of your call, she said. Is everything okay? Daniel looked up slowly. Not annoyed. Just measured. Everything's fine. It sounded like a big move, she continued. Are we exposed if it doesn't work? He paused for half a second too long. We, he repeated. The word hung between them. She felt the distance in that single syllable. I just mean, since we're married, she clarified. Daniel set his fork down neatly and leaned back in his chair. Emily, he said calmly, this is what I do. It's complicated. You don't need to stress about it. There it was again. You don't need. She wasn't asking for control. She was asking for inclusion. And suddenly she saw it clearly. She didn't know the passwords to their accounts. She didn't understand the structure of his investments. Her name wasn't on most of the decisions. She wasn't protected. She was dependent. The next morning, she walked through the apartment slowly, noticing everything with new eyes. The marble floors, the silent piano, the city view. It all looked the same, but she felt different. For the first time, the space didn't feel like luxury. It felt like leverage. That afternoon, she made a call. Not to a friend, not to her parents, to a lawyer, just for information, just to understand. When she sat across from the attorney 2 days later, listening to the explanation of the document she had signed before marriage, her chest felt tight. If the marriage ends, the lawyer said, you leave with what you personally brought in. Nothing more. Nothing more. She nodded slowly. On the drive home, the truth settled fully. If Daniel's risky decision failed, she would have no safety net. If he chose to leave, she would have no protection. If she stayed silent, she would remain invisible. That night, she didn't wait for the perfect moment. She didn't prepare a speech. She simply spoke. I don't feel like your partner, she said quietly. Daniel looked at her, surprised but not shaken. You're my wife, he replied. That's not the same thing. Silence stretched between them. I want to work, she continued. I want access. I want to understand what's happening in my own life. Daniel's expression changed slightly. Not anger, not sadness. Something colder. You're overthinking this, he said. You wouldn't survive without me. The sentence was meant to end the conversation. Instead, it ended the marriage. Because in that moment, she realized something undeniable. The only reason she might not survive without him was because she had allowed him to remove every part of her independence. And that was something she could change. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just nodded once. And inside, something locked into place. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of losing comfort. She was afraid of losing herself permanently. And that fear was stronger. The divorce process moved faster than she expected. There were no dramatic scenes. No screaming arguments. Just paperwork, scheduled meetings, and quiet signatures. Daniel handled it the same way he handled everything else in his life, efficiently. Emily sat across from her lawyer and listened carefully as the final terms were explained again. Because of the agreement she had signed before the wedding, she would leave with what she personally owned. Nothing from the penthouse. Nothing from the joint accounts. No share of investments. No financial cushion. It wasn't unfair. It was legal. And that somehow made it harder. When she packed her suitcase, she moved slowly. Not because she was unsure, but because she was fully aware of what she was walking away from. The lifestyle. The comfort. The image of success she had once admired. The elevator doors closed behind her one last time. No one stopped her. No one asked her to stay. The new apartment was smaller than she remembered her old one being. The walls were plain. The kitchen had basic appliances. There was no skyline view, just a parking lot and a grocery store across the street. The first night, she sat on the floor because she didn't have furniture yet. A takeout container rested beside her. The room echoed slightly when she moved. It felt empty, but it felt honest. The next morning, reality arrived quickly. She updated her resume. It looked thin. 3 years without formal work experience. No major accomplishments. No promotions. Interviews were uncomfortable. What have you been doing the last few years? One hiring manager asked. She hesitated, then answered truthfully. I stepped away from my career. That was a mistake. Some interviews ended quickly. Some never called back. Money moved faster now. Rent. Utilities. Deposits. Every dollar had a purpose again. For a brief moment, doubt tried to return. You had security, it whispered. You had stability. But then she remembered the silence of the penthouse. The quiet emptiness. And she kept going. After weeks of searching, she received an offer for an entry-level position as a junior marketing assistant at a small company. The salary was modest. The office wasn't impressive. But when she read the email, her heart beat faster. It wasn't glamorous. It was hers. Her first day felt awkward. She wasn't the youngest person in the room, but she felt inexperienced. She asked questions, took notes, stayed late without being asked. When her first paycheck hit her bank account, she stared at the number for a long time. It was smaller than anything she had access to during her marriage. But this time it felt different. This time it had her name on it. She held her phone in her hand and allowed herself a small smile. She wasn't comfortable. She wasn't protected. She wasn't wealthy. But she was building again. And building feels better than decorating someone else's empire. That night, sitting at her small kitchen table with a notebook open in front of her, she began writing ideas again. Campaign concepts, strategy notes, goals. The handwriting looked familiar. Alive. For the first time since she left the penthouse, she didn't feel like she had lost everything. She felt like she had finally stopped losing herself. 1 year later, Emily stood in a glass conference room holding a remote in her hand. The office wasn't luxurious. The chairs weren't designer. The view wasn't a skyline. But the room was full, and people were listening to her. She took a steady breath and began presenting her marketing proposal. Her voice was clear. Not loud, not aggressive, just confident. She explained the strategy, the numbers, the risks, the timing. No one interrupted her. No one corrected her sentences. When someone asked a tough question, she answered without shrinking. The version of her that once asked for permission to enroll in a simple course was gone. This version built her own arguments. When the meeting ended, her manager stopped her near the door. "That was strong," he said. "You should lead the next campaign too." Lead. The word felt solid. Not handed to her. Earned. Later that evening, she walked back to her apartment. It was still simple. Still modest. But now it felt lived in. A small couch. A second-hand bookshelf. Notes taped near her desk. Her phone buzzed in her hand. An unknown number. She stared at it for a moment before answering. Silence on the other end. Then Daniel's voice. "I heard you're doing well." His tone hadn't changed. Calm. Controlled. "Yes," she replied simply. A pause. "I made some bad calls this year," he said. "The market shifted. Things changed." She listened, but she didn't step back into the old dynamic. She didn't feel smaller. She didn't feel rescued. "I hope you figure it out," she said evenly. Another pause. "You don't sound the same," he added. She looked around her apartment. The small table. The lamp she chose herself. The notebook filled with her ideas. "I'm not," she answered. There was nothing else to say. She ended the call. No anger. No regret. Just distance. She set her phone down and walked to the window. The view wasn't impressive. Just streetlights and passing cars. But it was real. It belonged to her. 3 years ago, she thought money would protect her from fear. But money had only protected her from effort. Effort, she had learned, builds identity. Security without voice is just comfort with conditions. And comfort can disappear overnight. She once believed wealth meant safety. Now she understood something deeper. Real wealth is having choices. Real wealth is having skills. Real wealth is being able to survive on your own 2 feet. She didn't lose everything. She lost an illusion. And in losing it, she found something stronger. Herself. Fade out.